Hello and welcome to the Mysticast, where you join me, Jack Stafford, a student of metaphysics, as I talk to a variety of guests to better understand the teachings given by the Masters through the Aetherius Society, the new cosmic religion for the Aquarian Age, incorporating all yogas, Christian mysticism, theosophy, UFOs, and much, much more. Please note that this is an independent broadcast, not produced or fact-checked by the Aetherius Society. Today, my guest is the author and anthropologist, Wade Davis. Great. Well, this is a real pleasure to speak to you. I'm just, of all the people I could speak to, you struck me as one of the most interesting. And so I don't have a whole list of questions here. I just want to just chat to you about your life, basically, because you had a wild ride there. I mean, you had a pretty crazy adventure.
Yeah. I've always lived by the old adage of Jim Whittaker, the first American to summit Everest, who said, if you're not living on the edge when you're young, you're taking up too much space.
And didn't you say, like, if you, it's not an adventure if you're not suffering and in
No, I
discomfort
don't.
and
No, you don't. I
uncertain?
mean, absolutely not. I mean, I think only, to sort of set out to seek discomfort is
Mm,
is is a kind of fool's game. It's like the travel writer who kind of deliberately bumbles their way into misadventures just so
mm.
they have some fodder for their books. I mean, if
Yeah, yeah.
my great professor, uh, Dick Schultes, who was probably the greatest Amazonian explorer, certainly of the 20th century, always said that adventures only happen to those who are unprepared. And so, the adventure is a journey itself, and the
Mm,
encounters one has with other remarkable people, in my case, other cultures.
mm. I noticed when I've been traveling through music and I did a lot of backpacking with the guitar and, if you're just open to an adventure, every day is just a story and something happens because when you're moving through, and I was moving through civilization, you've been through areas,
Well,
I
I
think,
mean,
uncharted.
Jack, that's kind of the purpose of travel. I mean, I think that's what distinguishes, in a sense, travel from tourism. I mean, the tourism these days,
Uh,
people can jump off in a day and reach virtually any part of the world,
mm,
stay for a week and get back in time for their cousin's wedding. Um, Real travel is when you go with no itinerary, no plans, no certainty of return, and with only the promise that by definition you'll come back a different person. I mean, that's the nature
mm,
of travel. That's the pilgrimage. The point of the pilgrimage is not the destination; it's to achieve a state of mind. And so the classic notion of travel. And incidentally, to this day, virtually the vast percentage of tourism, as we might call it, in India is indeed still sacred pilgrimage as people move through landscape. And the idea there is that you're leaving a social space or your comfort zone, as we often say,
mm,
and you've got a kind of a destination in mind. But what you're really doing is you're moving through liminal space, that sort of place between what you know and what you're going to become. And and in that space, you're alone, and that's when
mm.
change can happen, right? And that's what the Irish always talk about, the thin places, the idea that you're looking for those points in the landscape that can be literal points or metaphorical points or even spiritual points where heaven and earth come together, if only for an instant, to reveal glimpses of the divine.
That's so poetic. I mean, you could tell you're a writer. You just probably don't have to. You probably write one draft now, and that's good to go. You just
Yeah, I don't do
wax
second
lyrical.
I
No,
don't I actually don't do rest.
because when I listen to back to my podcast, I often say, thinking words like, and but you're so, yeah, kudos to that. But you're most famous for, yeah, the Amazon and the exploring these far off places. But you're in BC now, is that right?
Well, I'm from British Columbia, and this was, very much, the foundation of who I am, and in a way, it's what allowed me to, I think, do what I did, in the sense
Mm,
that, you grow up in a small, family, modest family in Canada, and it's not particularly in the era of 1960s when I was a youth. It's not hard to kind of succumb to Baudelaire's malady, horror of home, and you face a choice, either
Mm,
kind of accepting the bourgeois conventional realm in which you were born, or you have to get out of it. And to get out of it often involves jumping off cliffs, And I, at a very early age, recognized that I had to get out into the world to become the person who I wanted to be. I didn't know who that person was, and that's a great line from Bob Dylan. Dylan always says, "You don't go out on the road to find yourself. You go out to the road to create yourself." And Jack, it's funny. I mean, I'm almost 70, and as you probably know, I do a great deal of public speaking, and sometimes, particularly if I'm giving a presentation that I've given before in one form or another, I can find myself kind of floating out of my body, and I don't mean this a a pretentious sense, but literally sort of, just because I'm bored at the podium, kind of floating out of the body and watching this person, give this rap, if you will. And the rap's very elegant and very eloquent, and, but I'm looking down at that podium, and I'm thinking, how the fuck did that little kid from that little suburb of Montreal grow up to be a man who has these thoughts? And I say that not in a self-aggrandizing sense, but think this is really the wonderful thing about the journey of life is, um, we can't control the cards we're given at birth, but between that moment and the moment of death, it's in our hands, right? So how do you deal with that? And often when I'm, asked, people look at my life often, and as we look at any life that we think is, you know, a good one or a realized one or one that has elements that we would like to emulate, just as I did when I was a young boy, looking up at my mentors and heroes and role models, if you will. And you think, how the heck can I ever become like Gary Snyder or uh, Jack Kerouac, if that's your model? It wouldn't be my model. Um, and 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 the answer is, of course, is that we're 70 years old and we've had a long time to build these lives, right? And so when I say to young people, I always say, life is, it you have to accept a few tenets that, despair, uh, pessimism is an indulgence, despair an insult to the imagination, orthodoxy the enemy of invention. You have to do what needs to be done, and only then ask whether it was possible or permissible. And the work you have is, or your job, is just a lens through which through which you see the world, and only for a while. And the goal of life is to make your life itself your vocation, knowing that it will take time, and you have to be an opportunist, and not in terms of being a schemer, but just in terms of putting yourself in the way of opportunities when you're young, so that there's no in moments where there's just no choice but success. And failure is simply not an option. And then one of the things you discover along the way is that creativity isn't something that other people have and you don't have. Creativity is not the motivation of action. Creativity is a consequence of action. You can't create if you don't do. And the great bourgeois conundrum is the false sense that creativity happens to other people. And for me, it took a long while to realize that, and and again, if you had known the circumstances of my upbringing, it would be very difficult to ever imagine that I would be a filmmaker or a photographer or, for that matter, a writer. But all of that said, back to your question about British Columbia, one of the great things about growing up here, particularly in that generation, was that we all, we all encountered the bush. It sounds
Mm.
funny. It's a little bit like in Australia. Do you live your life out in the suburbs of Sydney or Melbourne, or even Darwin or Perth? Or do you actually get back, in Arnhem Land, and find out
Yeah,
what it
yeah.
means to be Australian? And in Canada, we had the opportunity to do that. So without really having to work at it, I found myself fighting forest fires at 15 and, cutting trail, working in logging camps. And in retrospect, that was as much and as useful an initiation as the years I spent at Harvard. And again, this gets back to an important theme for, I think, for young people. Nothing is a waste of time unless you make it so. No task or job is beneath you unless you think of it that way. And the most humble taxi cab driver can have as much to teach you as a university professor. I remember, Jack, I was once in a cab in Washington, D.C., and there was this African American driver who looked a little bit old, and I was very polite, and I said, "Sir, I don't mean to be rude, but you look a little old for this job. It's a tough city." And he said, "Son, how old do you think I am?" And I said, "Sir, well, I don't want to be, rude here, but you look like late 70s, early 80s. I mean, man, this is a tough town." And he leaned back to me and he said, "Son, I'm 97 years old." And I
Oh
said,
my God.
97 years old, driving cab in Washington, D.C. You look so great. You look so young. What's the secret to your longevity and good health?" And he leaned back to me, Jack, and he said, "Son, I don't worry about a fucking thing." And to me, that was wisdom, right? I mean,
Mm.
probably in his circumstances, that gentleman had never had much education, but that didn't mean he wasn't wise. And so that's something that's very much been kind of a almost a lodestone or a compass of my life, is to always recognize that everybody has something to teach me.
Wow. I guess it's that curiosity that drives you because, yeah, I've driven across Canada and you're all close to the border now. It's all just this one long thin line of I've never felt
Ah,
that it.
for some Canadians. But you see, it's what above that line, Jack, is what makes Canada, because you see, Americans look west for heroes, Canadians look north. And the weight
Oh,
of the
right,
north,
yeah.
the weight of the north hovers in the Canadian imagination and creates the essence of the national soul. It's the weight of the winter. That's why the most perfect expression of Canadian patriotism is a line of Francophone verse from Gilles Vigneault, who said, "My country is not a country, it's the winter." And so it is astonishing, but it's like in Australia. I mean, how many people never leave,
Mm.
Sydney or whatever, it is true that most Canadians like the idea of the North, but they never go there. But I do go there, and it's an extraordinary, immense landscape. You could remember, the lower 48 of the United States, continental United States, turn on its side and still have 1,500 kilometers of Canada running away to the North Pole. I mean, the Canadian North is the kind of place we could throw England, and the English would never find it.
Yes. Fit in one little lake. Yeah.
I mean, for
So
most of
that
our history, we had more lakes than people. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I own a fishing lodge, a fancy term for kind of a funky fish camp up north on a lake, only place on a 7-kilometer lake, and nearest town's a 7-hour drive. I mean, the only other people that I know that can kind of grok that are the Aussies. It's like when you're in Melbourne, and you say,
Mm.
"Oh, go out to Perth for the next day," and then you get on a plane, and 7 hours later, you're still in the air. I mean, it's like that scale of landscape. And
Yeah.
I think interesting. I mean, landscape determines character. Culture springs from a spirit of place. We are a reflection of our land. I mean, Margaret Atwood said it in terms of Canada. If you wanted to understand the essence of Canada, the United States, and England, you just needed to know three words, and that for America, frontier, and for England, island, and for Canada, survival, because it is the weight of the North. I mean, Just think about this. Have you ever thought about, Jack, the life of the Inuit? I've spent a lot of time in the Arctic with the Inuit. Imagine being in a place, well, you can actually in Australia almost, with no wood, right?
Yeah.
Inuit didn't fear the cold; they took advantage of it. The runners of their sleds were made of fish. And the supports for their sleds were made of frozen walrus meat. Peter Freuchen, the great explorer, the Danish explorer, said the great thing about a Inuit is that if you ran out of food, you could eat your sled. You know,
Wow. Gosh, all these experiences, but going back to what you said about the journey within, and because this is a mystical podcast, I'm trying to understand, um, consciousness and the survival of consciousness, and so on all your journeys and all your writings, you've encountered a lot of strange experiences, and you talk about floating out of your body there and having an experience like that, but um, yeah, so I'm trying to understand that a continuation of consciousness, and I'm a member of the Aetherius Society, which is a new mystic religion for the Aquarian age. And one of the quotes from the masters is that imagination is man's only creative faculty, and that what you said there reminded me of that. And that is that you know when you obviously not when you're in the outback there or in the with the Inuit, we're looking at the natural landscape, but everything we see is from man's creativity. No, I'm talking to you through another man imagined this microphone, another man imagined Zoom.
right?
We drive down the roads, we drive down people's old imagination, and so that just inspired me to tell you that quote when
Well,
I heard that.
yeah, I mean, Jack, I mean, that's sort of, back to what I've tried to focus on, and what drew me to anthropology was, we had this 19th century notion, inspired by Darwin, that if species evolved, surely cultures evolved, and we created this kind of model that certainly served the colonial enterprise, that somehow we went as a species through a series of stage sets, from the savage to the barbarian, invariably to the
Mm,
civilized at the Strand of London, this sort of notion of evolutionary culture. I mean, the word survival of the fittest was coined not by a biologist, but by an anthropologist, Herbert Spencer. And that idea of development in a century of racism and imperialism was a kind of cold intellectual convenience, which has been utterly exposed by modern activist anthropology, as an artifact of the 19th century, no more relevant to our lives today than the notion that clergymen had then, that the earth was just 6,000 years old. And yet that idea has persisted. And if the first sort of activist anthropologists were sort of saying that's ridiculous, every culture is a product of its own history. Every culture is just a unique answer to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? And people answer that question in 7,000 different languages of humanity, and that collectively this becomes a human repertoire, and that the very existence of these other ways of thinking put the lie to those of us, say, for example, in our own cultural tradition, who suggests that we cannot change when we all know we must change the fundamental way we inhabit the planet. And this was kind of an idea, a hope, a dream in a way of these anthropologists, going back to Franz Boas and Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, this great cadre that clustered around Boas in New York in the 1920s and 30s. And amazingly, genetics has proven it to be true, in the sense that we now know that the human genetic endowment, by definition, is a continuum. Race, biologically, is an utter fiction. We're all cut from the same genetic cloth, and in fact, we're all, we now know, descendants of Africa, including those of us who walked out of the ancient continent some 65,000 years ago and embarked on this incredible journey that carried the human spirit and imagination to all parts of the world. But here's the important point. If we're cut from the same genetic cloth, by definition, we share the same human genius. And critically, how that genius is expressed is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. So there is no hierarchy of progress in the affairs of humans. I mean, take the Aboriginal people of Australia. It's the ultimate example. When the British first got there, they saw people that looked strange, had a simple material technology. But what really offended the British was that the Aboriginal civilization, all 10,000 clan territories in 670 languages and dialects in the most parsimonious continent on earth, had no interest in improving upon their lot materially. And since progress optimism was the very ethos of Europe at that time, notions that, of course, died in the mud and blood of Flanders in the Great War, but very much alive during the settlement of Australia, the British, um, concluded in their inimitable way that Aboriginal people weren't human, and they began to shoot them. And as recently as 1902, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne as to whether or not Aboriginal people were human or not. As recently as the 1950s in Australia, there are quotas as to how many Abos could be shot with impunity who trespassed upon land that had been claimed by Europeans. Uh, in 1960s, I had an old maid in Alice Springs, an anthropologist who told me when he grew up, uh, there was a book used in the school curriculum of Australia called A Treasury of Fauna of Australia that listed, amongst the other forms of wildlife, the Aboriginal people. In other words, but what was missing in this European encounter was an understanding of a very subtle devotional philosophy, which was the dreaming. And as a great Australian anthropologist, Stammer, wrote, he's got a great book called White Man Got No Dreaming, and uh, that the entire ethos in Australia was the antithesis of progress. It was, in fact, stasis. And the goal of life was not to change the world, but to the contrary, do the ritual gestures along the song line that happened to traverse your clan territory, the ritual gestures deemed to be necessary to keep the world exactly as it had always been. It's almost like as if in European tradition, we had spent all of our energy and intellectual acumen maintaining the Garden of Eden, pruning the shrubs of the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was at the time of that fateful conversation between Adam and Eve. Now, the interesting thing isn't to say who's right and who's wrong. Had humanity followed that devotional trajectory as a whole, yeah, we wouldn't have developed allopathic medicine or put a man on the moon. On the other hand, we wouldn't be talking about climate change and our capacity to transform the life support systems of the planet. So you have to ask yourself, at least speculatively, in 10,000 years, as we look back, if we're still kicking around, which way of thinking will have proven to be the most adaptive and clever?
Yeah, that's so interesting because what you're making me think also is that I've just seen this Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse series on Netflix. Have you seen that? Are you aware
Mm.
of his work?
Yeah, sure.
He, he goes and I think his basic argument is that there is a lot of archaeology structures older than 6,000 years, and even the one the big ones, um, we needed a developed civilization to make those, and it's quite rational that because hunter gatherers still exist now on the earth, independent to us. The people went over to Australia and they found them hundreds of years ago, and they civilizations exist in different areas. So it's not irrational to think that there is. I mean, when you were in the Amazon, did you see it on Aztecs? I mean, it must seem mind blowing structures. You must wonder about that 6,000-year-old number.
Well, 6,000 years old that's just a kind of calculation from Genesis
Mm.
that has no historical meaning. It's just a, 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 a kind of e- examination and deduction based on biblical text. I
Mm.
mean, it's no grounding in actual history, and no one actually these days would pretend that it does. Um, but certainly the depth of civilization. I mean, that said, uh, I've always been very careful with speculation that seems to lean toward uh, having to invoke fantasy, or as if what's out there is not good enough. In other words, it's sort of like that old. There was a book that came out, "The Secret Life of Plants," that made great claims about plants responding to Mozart or human touch. And
Mm.
I had a great friend of mine, great botanist who passed away, uh, who was a great poet and a great botanist and also a musician, but he hated that book. And he used to say to me, "Why would a plant give a shit about Mozart? And even if it did, why should that impress us? They can eat light. Isn't that enough?" In other words, the wonder of what we know to exist, even in prehistory, whether it's going back to understanding the roots of the Inca in all the pre-Columbian civilizations that predated the sudden rise in the 15th century of the Inca. Um, we know a lot about that, and what we know is extraordinarily wondrous. And we won't be benefit by invoking, or indulging speculation that is just that is titillating but not grounded in any evidence. It's a little bit like, when Shirley MacLaine, you know, sort of reported that the stonework of the Inca had to have been the work of Martians or something, like it. And no more fanciful than the early Spaniard conquistadores saying that it was the work of the devil. I mean, both suggestions are both silly, but also demeaning. They deny the Incaic people their greatest engineering achievement, which was in fact carving those stones. So I've always, you know, um, and I guess as a scholar or as a writer or whatever, you know, really kept one foot grounded in science. And history as we understand it to be. Uh, and then that allows you to take that step into the realm of the imagination, and a place that is undeniably rich and fertile and accessed in so many different ways through ordeal, through ceremony, through the ingestion of these sacred medicines. Having been in those realms, I also kind of honor those realms, and I'm curious about what those realms imply for all of us, in the same sense that I can't help but wonder what came for me before birth, as I anticipate what may come for me after death.
You believe in the continuation of consciousness?
I think that every um, you know, every speculation as to what happens to us in the afterlife should come with a caveat. Like every church, my father
Mm.
used to say, should have a billboard outside of it saying "important if true."
That's a good
Because the
one, yeah.
truth is, we don't know. And I mean, that's the
Mm.
fascinating thing about religion. I mean, basically, every single religion comes down to a single question: what happens to us after we die? In the same way that all of human intellectual endeavor comes down to two questions: why and how. And
Mm.
it's why there's no conflict really between religion and science, because they ask different questions. Science asks the question how, and religion asks the question why. And death is the first teacher by definition. It's the edge beyond which life as we know it ends and wonder begins. And how any culture deals with that inexorable separation that death implies generally, plays a major role in determining their mystical worldview, whether it's shamanic practices in a small hunting and gathering society or the elaborate construct of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah. But all these lost civilizations, I mean, how little we know about them, the Aztecs and even the Egyptians seem to be they didn't even build the pyramids, it seems. They didn't have the tools. They just
Well,
They
that's
were
not
kind of
true. No,
caretakers.
that's just not true. We know exactly how the pyramids were built. It's not complicated. We know exactly how the Inca carved their stones. It's not complicated. You
Mm,
don't have to. And the minute you start invoking the metaphysical or the mystical to explain simple engineering achievements, we have to always remember how much that denies the brilliance of those engineers. Remember, look, you think of the Incas being an ancient civilization. They're
mm,
yesterday. The Inca began in 1438 uh, at the battle at the head of the Apurimac River when they took on their enemy, the Chanca. And in this kind of mythical event,
mhm.
obviously also a literal battle, they pushed back the Chanca and the Inca fled the field, but his son stood. And they say stones became warriors and they defeated their enemy. But from that moment on, that lad took on the title of Pachacuti, the transformer of the world, and began the expansion of what had been a small tribal society with antecedents in the Cusco region, a sophisticated society, but one that then became imperial, if you will, and the expansion of the Inca was less than 100 years. In that 100 years, they built 14,000 miles of road. They created storehouse.
What?
They created
Wow.
sto- they created storehouses where you could preserve hundreds of thousands of bushels of freeze dried potatoes
Mm,
and tuber crops and other tuber crops. I mean, the logistical achievement of the Inca was extraordinary. And they did it all in less than 100 years. There only were three Inca rulers that we know from the expansion of the empire, Pachacuti, Topangu Yupanqui, and his son Huayna Capac. And then when
mm,
Huayna Capac died of smallpox before the Spaniards even reached Peru, there was a civil war because the empire had extended all the way from southern Colombia to the Mole River in Chile. And the north was Atahualpa, the south was Huascar, and they were in civil war when the Spaniards arrived. The point is that, we know a lot about and the more we know about how the Inca expanded so quickly, the more wondrous it becomes, and the more disrespectful it becomes to invoke fantasy to try to account for their achievements. Just because we can't imagine doing something doesn't mean that other people's can't do it. That was a
mm,
big lesson for me. I remember, the question in terms of keeping on the Inca for a second, you know, how did they move those big stones at Sacsayhuaman above the fortress above Cusco? Well, this is why, because we couldn't imagine doing it ourselves with the tools that they had. That's why you get these kind of ridiculous speculations of either the phantasmagoric, like spacemen did it, or whatever, right? But actually, what the real challenge is trying to remember what the mindset of the Inca would have been. First of all, for them, stone wasn't cold granite; it was the embodiment of life itself. And we know, incidentally, that using a simple drop technique, you can turn a block of andesite into a perfectly symmetrical ashlar, not in weeks or months, but in hours and days. And of course, for that work, it was work for the divine, the Inca. And for such a purpose, time had no meaning. So that attitude towards stone, together with the attitude towards work and time, brought together by an empire, the genius of which was logistics.
mm,
Um, you know, their ability to march armies of thousands of men across the Atacama Desert, put that all together, and it suddenly isn't quite such a surprise that Machu Picchu could be built with a single architectural plan. And again, remember, this is only 500 years ago and slightly more. And we share the same genius that they had. They shared our genius, and they are capable of great things. It's not, they were, for all intents and purposes, you know, um, modern human beings. In terms of
mhm.
in terms of the long scale of our evolution history. So it shouldn't surprise us, but we don't, again, we don't need to invoke the fantasy to to recognize the brilliance of what was in
Mm,
fact achieved. And the same thing is kind of true with the Maya, or the Aztec. Yes, we don't know everything, but I'm always amazed by how much archaeologists have been able to decipher. I mean, I've been at ancient sites, buried in the forests of Guatemala, like El Mirador, where 7 of the 8 biggest pyramids in the world are. One pyramid alone, the base of it is larger than the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. These were monumental structures, and they were built by people. And that's incredible and kind of wondrous thing.
yeah. Oh, I can't argue with you about all these facts and details. I just want to, watching those documentaries, they do kind of make a good case. They do these lidar scans. Is that right? And they can see there's older pyramids inside there, and
Oh,
because
no, I
of they
mean,
built.
part of what you're seeing is ground testing, which is a whole new extraordinary, capacity to see through canopy of the forest to the ground cover.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the but, again, this is not and our sense of understanding is changing all the time. And the classic place would be the Amazon basin,
Mhm.
where for years, anthropologists have sort of even though anthropologists have sort of described it as a kind of in the words of a famous anthropologist, a counterfeit paradise where human beings sort of have to sort of scramble to survive, with slash and burn agriculture. Well, this idea came about for a couple reasons. First of all, it reinforced a very important environmental agenda by suggesting that these forests were in fact delicate and frail, and secondly, it reflected the fact that but when anthropologists first got into the basin in numbers, they were drawn to the extent societies that were living along the margins of the basin, isolated from development by the rivers and cataracts and distance to the east, and the Andean Cordillera to the west, which wasn't penetrated by roads until the 1940s. And so these small endogenous cultures, often in open conflict with their neighbors, marrying amongst themselves, became our model for what human life must have been like in the Amazon. But when you look back to 1541, when Aureliana becomes the first Spaniard with his scribe Caspar de Carvajal to go down the Amazon, he doesn't go through an empty forest. It's densely
Yeah, I was going to
populated.
ask you about this. Yeah,
And
yeah.
we now know that there were probably 10 million people living in the Amazon basin. And
Before he passed through with smallpox and
yeah, I mean, don't
yeah,
forget smallpox didn't, you often hear that smallpox decimated people. Well, that's
yeah.
not true because decimate in Latin means to kill 1 in 10. It, in fact, was
Uh,
9
uh,
10 that were killed by smallpox. And as I mentioned in the case of Huayna Capac, the pestilence often arrived before the Europeans did, following
mm,
traditional trade routes. So it was like really a miasma. I mean, here on the coast of British Columbia, very late to European contact. I mean, here in British Columbia, I knew a man I recorded myth from for many, many years, and he was an old chief and elder and very respected hunter, Gitsan by birth, married into the Second, but also lived amongst the Taltan. And and Alex was 43 before he had sustained contact with white people. Hard to imagine, right? But even here, the smallpox swept up the coast in 1862. And even to this day, the First Nations, the Haida, the Nuu-chah-nulth, Kwakwaka'wakw, and others will remember it as being a cloud of blue haze that came up the coast. Well, we know biologically that smallpox didn't manifest itself as a blue cloud, but that description of it perfectly encapsulates the perception that people had of this invisible pestilence that is swept over their lives. And, the thing about smallpox, of course, it had huge levels of mortality, but before it killed, it disfigured in the most hideous way. So it's not just that, your son went to bed and didn't get up in the morning. Before your son or daughter beloved wife succumbed to the disease, their entire body was disfigured with the most horrific and nauseating pustules of the pathogen. And so it had a psychological impact on the survivors, many of whom lived their lives pockmarked by the disease, as much as the death of the people, crushed their emotions. It must have been just most hideous of all diseases.
Makes COVID look like a piece of cake.
It makes COVID look like a piece of cake. That's true.
I saw you wrote an excellent piece in the Rolling Stone about COVID and how it's transforming our society.
Well, that was a funny story, Jack, because during the height of COVID, and that piece you're referring to was written in late July of 2020. And a lot of people had asked me to write about COVID, and I didn't really feel I had anything new to say. And then one day I was just paddling my kayak around our little island here, and I suddenly had this sort of idea or thought that COVID really wasn't about medicine or public health. It was really a story of culture. And I came back and I wrote on spec a kind of essay thinking about that in terms of the kind of looking at the United States, which at that time, if you can recall, was uniquely in trouble with COVID. And it was almost like the end of American exceptionalism, as you were. So I wrote this piece and I sent it to my old friend Jan Wenner, who created Rolling Stone. And Jan liked it and sent it to his son, who now runs the company. And Gus got a great editor on it. We cut it down from maybe 7,000 words to 5,000. And we put it up on the website with no expectations. I didn't even ask for a fee. I just did it and it just went viral. It had 362 million social media impressions and 5 million people read it on Rolling Stone. It was like their top essay of the year. And it hit a nerve, I guess, and I think what made it of interest and not a lot of it doesn't, like all these pieces written in the heat of the moment, they don't always hold up. And there are elements in that essay where I was quite wrong,
Yeah, hindsight.
but in the moment, it hit a nerve because it touched on issues that everybody was feeling, particularly in the United States, where there was a sense of what the heck is happening to us. You had this buffoon of a president recommending, bathroom detergent as a treatment for the disease. There was a prospect of his reelection. America seemed to have more morbidity and mortality than any other country. And the country that had virtually created the greatest advancements of science suddenly was dependent on the Chinese for swabs and basic medical supplies. It just seemed as if it was a symbol of the end of the American era. And I think, as I said, some elements there I was wrong, but I think it was prescient in the fact that I think it is, the unraveling of America. And I think it's continued to this day. No empire lasts forever. Everyone is born to die. And if you think about it, the 15th century belonged to the Portuguese, and the 16th to the Spanish, 17th to the Dutch, 18th to the French, 19th to the British, 20th to the Americans. And certainly at that point in time, it wasn't clear that there would be another century of American dominance. But I did say in that essay, which I thought was more like it wasn't a critique of America. It was more like an intervention with a beloved family member, where the first step is to show them what they've become, so that they
Right.
look in the mirror and see what they think they are, but actually pay attention to what you've become. And what happened to the America that emerged from World War II, very much the moral high ground, very much, having through industrial might literally saved civilization. What happened to an economy that in 1945 made 95% of the world's automobiles? What happened to the social contract with the working man and woman that allowed someone to have a factory job and actually raise a family in good schools, buy a car and buy a home. All of that, what's become of a country that, has more um, uh, deaths through gunshots um, in the first 3 months of every year than the Americans suffered in the D-Day campaign of World War II. So what is that all about? And that's what that essay was trying to unravel. And we're now trying to, you know, and I think the fundamental structural things about contemporary American society um, were quite accurate in that piece, and they and I've seen no reason to change my opinion on that.
Yeah. Do you think you see yourself as an outsider, but you get these perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that's absolutely was flawed in that article because at the time, um, Canada was doing very, very well with COVID, particularly British Columbia. And I quoted Robin Williams, who famously said that to live in Canada is like living in an apartment above a meth lab. You know, and there is that feeling in Canada. Not that Canada's a perfect place. On the contrary, um, but there are the bond. There is a bond of solidarity, fraying in Canada for sure. Um, but that is brought together um, here that you don't find in the States. And a big element of that, as you know, in Australia is universal health care. I mean, healthcare in Canada is hugely problematic. We the delays in treatment. It's designed to be able to treat everybody, and it
Mm,
does very well with trauma. But preventative healthcare is very complicated because the system is overtaxed. I'm sure you're going through the same thing in Australia. So it's no perfect system. The wait for procedures can be, if not life threatening, can certainly be, an issue for people. But
mm,
and when we critique the healthcare system because of those faults, we often forget that healthcare universal healthcare has an element to it that has nothing to do with medicine, which may be its most important attribute, and that is social solidarity. The key thing about universal healthcare is sending a message to the whole country that every individual matters, and that if your child gets sick, they will get the same care, even if the care is flawed in
mm,
certain ways in terms of, wait lists and so on. They will still get the same care that your kid gets, and then indeed the prime minister's kid would get. I mean, if you ever, and I say it seriously, everybody thinks that's impossible. But if you wanted to pick one single thing in a place like Canada, that would mean the end of your political career, would be any evidence that you use your political clout, no matter what your office, to get your kid to the front of a queue in a hospital. If you did that in Canada, I believe your career would be over. That would create the kind of outrage that would be universal in the electorate. And so I think that, so healthcare is really about social solidarity as much as it's about um, medicine. So, I
mm,
mean,
mm,
that's something the Americans simply do not understand. If you go to your grocery store in the United States or uh, Canada, the experience is so different. There's a kind of a social, economic, class, racial, educational chasm often between you and the checkout person that's unbridgeable. And you don't really feel that in the same way in Canada. And the reason is kind of obvious, that the person at the till may not have your education, your affluence, or your privilege, whatever language you want to use, but they probably send their kids to the same public school that you do, because these stores are based in neighborhoods. And they know that that they're probably getting a living wage because of the unions, right? And then the
mm.
third element, of course, is the fact that they know that if their kids get sick, they get the same care as your kids. And those three things, those strands, if you will, woven together, become the social fabric of democracy. That's what social democracy is about. That's And that's what obviously the Scandinavian nations have achieved in such an extraordinary way.
Well, it makes a big difference between America and Canada, no? That's that
Huge,
solidarity. Yeah.
huge. And then the other thing is simply guns. I mean, the incredible thing is that, people are always trying to suggest the Americans are inherently violent. Well, I mean, what about, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Russians, the Germans? I mean, don't tell me that the Americans are uniquely violent in the history of the world. I mean, no. I mean, the problem, in fact, study after study shows that the American people are really no different than any other extended population. The only difference is everybody and their dog owns several guns. I mean, we have guns in Canada. I mean, I own 5 rifles, but I don't use them to kill people. I mean,
Mm.
I've got a fish camp. I've got grizzly barrel. Of course, you have guns loaded over the
Yeah.
door. But
Yeah, yeah.
the idea of having a handgun or a machine gun, it's just insane. But in the States, if you look at the statistics, Jack, there are more guns in America than people. And it's no wonder that every day there's another killing. I mean, look,
Mm.
yesterday in Half Moon Bay, the day before in Southern California. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
daily occurrence in the United
Yeah.
States. I mean, I, I, I've been, here's a funny story for you guys down under. You know, I've been working on this idea of a film series or a documentary feature based on that Rolling Stone piece, like the
Yeah.
unraveling America, kind of, a road trip through America, not in judgment, but in love and empathy, basically asking what's become of my friend, because I'm not
Mm.
anti-American in the slightest. I mean, I became an American citizen. I'm a Colombian citizen. I'm an Irish citizen. I'm a Canadian. So I have 4 passports, but I married an American. My kids are dual citizen and Irish. And
Mhm.
my father-in-law was almost president of the United States. He was a kind of ultimate American success story. My brother-in-law was a U.S. senator. I mean, my life was made possible in the United States. My life would never, ever, ever have been possible in Canada. Not for a chance, because there's
Wow.
such a conservative culture here. I mean,
Mm.
you know, um, when I first went to my great professor at the age of 19 as a total nobody, just a kid, a man for whom mountains had been named, and Prince Philip had called him the father of the Amazon and was legendary plant explorer. I just walked into his office at Harvard and said, "Sir, I've saved up money in a logging camp. I want to go to the Amazon like you did and collect plants." At the time, I'd never taken a botany course in my life. I had no idea even what the Amazon was. It was just a whim. And instead of asking me for my credentials, he looked across a mound of plant specimens through his antiquated bifocals and said very simply, "Well, son, when do you want to go?" Now, that would never in a million years have happened in Canada. So I have a great reverence for the United States, but, um, you know, with this idea of sort of, you know, going, across it to try to ask this question, where's the country going? Become of it? Um, that's that's sort of the idea I had. I think I've lost my train of thought, to be honest with you.
No, no, but if anthropology, I think, is the science that most interests me, and if you're gonna just to have that overall view of things, that to know, because history is interesting if you know your history.
Anthropology allows you to look beneath the surface of things. That's what it does. And you look at something as simple as the 2 American main popular sports, baseball and football. I mean, have you ever thought of how they originated? It's so different, right? And how different they are as sports. I mean, think of
Mm.
base. There are no time limits. There are no spatial limits. Uh, a game technically could go on in, indefinitely. Um, it's totally individualistic. Well, that's because it grew out of the sandlots of the 19th century and not the corporate universities of the 1920s. So the outfielders in baseball used to be called scouts. The uniforms were modeled on the uniforms of the engineers and the trains that closed the American frontier, the Yankee pinstripes, famously, right?
Oh,
Whereas,
yeah.
well, and it's completely individualistic. I mean, the hardest thing to do in sports is to hit a baseball. And the pitcher pitches, it's out of his control. The hitter hits, that's it. It's the guy alone in the left field has to make the play. It's like it's all about you, baby. It's you, you know?
Mhm.
It's not a it's not really even a team sport, and it's of course a team sport, but every play is quintessentially individualistic, right?
Mm.
And the whole motto of the game is doesn't matter how long it takes, as long as you get the job done. Well, that was the ethos of America, right? And then if you look at football, by contrast, it came out of the universities in the 1920s. It's got very strict time and spatial limits by definition. The players are anonymous, masked in gear. Each one is a cog in the machine. They can get injured and they're just plucked out of the machinery and another one's put in their place. It is a sport brutal in its physicality in ways that you can't even imagine. I mean, when you see two American football players have a helmet to helmet collision, there's a reason that those collisions were finally deemed to be penalties. And the reason is very simple. When that happens, when you have two 250-pound men who can run 100 yards in 4.6 seconds, and they collide, the the power of it's not the collision, it's the cessation of momentum that creates the dynamic, right? And so when those helmet collisions occur, it is literally the equivalent of having a bowling ball dropped on your head from 10 feet.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's no wonder that men are carried off the field in every game. What other sport in the world has 100% guarantee that you will be injured by playing it? I can't think of one.
Yeah.
And so you begin to look at America through that lens, and again, what does it say about America that you have on the one hand this sort of killing of George Floyd, which sparks this riots in every city, and then you also have the injury of the football player in the Buffalo Bills 2 weeks ago on the field that set the whole nation into mourning. So what's that all about? Ask that
Mm.
question. Two young black men um, confronting. It's just complicated. But the the fact that the football teams are predominantly African American, the
Mm.
coaching staffs remain predominantly white. There's a kind of disconnect there that America can't seem to come to terms with. Now, I have no problem understanding why African Americans dominate the field, because if you spend any time in Africa, you'll understand that the roots of racism are fundamentally jealousy. They're just so much better than I mean, being, so
Oh,
much
yeah.
hipper, so much the rhythm, the strength, the elegance. I mean, I've written 2 books on African religion and spent a lot of time in West Africa and of course Haiti, and simply astonished by uh, the cultural practices and wonder that I encountered in those travels.
Yeah, that's just, like I was saying, anthropology is the most interesting line of science. And if I could just bring it back to before we round up about metaphysics and about spirituality, I'd try and get to the teachings of the Aetherius Society, which I'm very into. And one thing I thought was interesting was about the the sun is the god in the Bible, and also the Brahma of the Hindu scripts. Um, they said that what Jesus taught is that the gods, the sun spoke the word and created the earth, and that's in the Bible also. And the Aztecs were worshiping the sun god, and so there were these parallels between those cultures.
Well, the thing is, Jack, I mean, it's interesting. Okay. You can then suddenly say, well, is there some kind of hidden message there? Or can you say, well, no shit, Sherlock. I mean, one of the fascinating things that I find about anthropology. We've talked even in this podcast about, you know, differences of culture, but the fantastic thing is also the inherent similarities in the sense that every single human population not only shares the same genetic endowment, therefore the same raw intellectual capacity, mental acuity, human
Mm,
potential, whatever you want to say, we also share the same exact adaptive imperatives. We all have our children. We all have to find ways to couple that are consistent. They can be different,
mm,
you across in different cultures, but within a culture, coupling has to be consistent, always is consistent. We all have to deal with the agony of growing old. We have to feed our children. We have to find ways to educate our children. We have to deal with the, as I said earlier, the inexorable mystery that death represents. And so we all face that challenge. We all wake up in the morning and see the sunrise. We see the sun set. We know the darkness comes on. We see light and darkness. We see hot and cold. This is the old dualistic idea of Claude Levi-Strauss, the raw and the cooked. We live in a world of dichotomies, of dualism, and we try to find a way to take that opposition, he would say, and resolve it in some kind of consistent harmony. Be that as it may, the fact the sun is revered all around the world could be telling us nothing more than the fact that we all, as human beings, wake up to the sun.
mm,
And so, you know, again, one doesn't have to sort of invoke grand theories of unity, or nefarious uh, uh, examples of conspiracy, simply because we deal with common perceptions and experiences. I mean, the wondrous thing to me is this fantastic notion that all human beings everywhere have the same, as I said, adaptive imperatives, and then we find ways to satisfy or uh, deal with those imperatives that are so incredibly distinct and curious and wondrous, right?
mm.
And and I guess this is to my mind, this has always been the purpose of anthropology, as Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead's lover and Franz Boas's great student, famously said, the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. And if there's one lesson of anthropology, it's that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're not
Oh,
failed
yeah, that's a good one.
they're not failed attempts at being modern.
Mm,
Every culture is a unique answer to that fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? And every culture, in answering that question, has something to say, and each deserves to be heard, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine.
yeah, and all the pyramids all over the world, I mean, they can arrive at the same. Uh,
Yeah, it doesn't mean that there was a master Martian pyramid designer, right? I mean,
yeah,
there's certain basic ways you can create a structure that
the
elevates you.
easiest
I mean,
ways.
in other words, again, that's a good example. Why invoke some kind of notion that there must have been, Mayan ancestors in Egypt? Because after all, how did the Egyptians learn to build these pyramids? No, how about the more beautiful idea is that human beings want to get close to the sky. We all know that. It makes perfect sense intuitively. We all look up. We it 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 doesn't a child looking at the clouds looks up to the divine. A
Mm,
child looking into a hole in the ground is looking towards hell. I mean, I'm not saying the earth is hell. What I mean is that it's
mm,
not rocket science to suggest that human aspirations for the divine would be looking to the stars, looking to the clouds, looking to the sun that is the source of life itself, and that our sense of a darker place, a place of death, would be below ground. Because for much of our history, of course, as in terms of a conscious species, we didn't have a sense of living on a round planet. We felt we were on an infinite flat plane of existence, right? And we constructed our imagination around that. And it just makes intuitive sense that the sense of the heavens would be high and a sense of death would be low, the comfort of the earth, all these metaphors that I think are universal perceptions of human beings. But that doesn't mean that because the Barasana in the Northwest Amazon bury their dead beneath the Maloca, in canoes facing down the Milk River, that they learned to do that by some ancient culture or contemporary culture in India that also happens to bury its dead uh, in a temple ground such that the living trod upon the memories of the dead with every footstep. I mean, this is not, you don't need to invoke, one doesn't need to invoke, everything is not directly and literally connected in that sense. And to suggest it does is to reduce the poetry of the imagination to the prose of the state.
Oh, I think that's a beautiful note to end on, that all your years of travel and exploring different cultures has led to a greater understanding and of these different cultures and
Yeah,
this
great.
humanity. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Jack,
Well, thank you.
nice to be with you.
Lovely to be you. Thanks again for taking the time to chat.
Okay, you fell. Bye-bye. Thank
Bye
you.
bye. Bye bye.